So today we have Harry Campbell from the Rideshare Guy. Very excited to have him on today and talk about this subject because I think that it does relate to everybody. And I think that a lot of people are missing this subject at this time. Like, I think that they're not really, they're either just complaining or they're
Yeah.
out, they're out, they're waiting till they go back to rideshare, or they're not going to go back to rideshare, or so many things. So today I want to talk to Terry about the future of rideshare and how we come out of this pandemic. It is pretty clear that the United States, at least, even though there's a lot of variants and other things going on, that we are coming out of the pandemic. I
Yeah.
think we can all agree on that. I mean, things are opening here in Colorado. We've been open for a while. I know that you guys are just creeping up on a full open, right?
Yeah, we're just, I guess, fully. I'm not sure exactly what's going to change, to be honest, because I've sort of, been living my life pretty much as normal since I got vaccinated a few months ago. But yeah, definitely jealous of some of the other states that have been operating and, sort of business back to normal. But I'm excited for it. And yeah, like you mentioned, definitely, we see huge, we're seeing a huge spike in demand from customers on rideshare services. So obviously they're ready to get out there and get back going. And I guess the question mark is whether the drivers are too.
Right. And so, okay. So with that, when so let's talk about, just in a nutshell here, like 2010 to pre-pandemic, just right before.
Okay. In a nutshell, 2010, the pre-pandemic. I mean, that's the last 10 years.
Right. And that's
but
the life of rideshare.
I'll give it to you in a nutshell. I mean, really, luckily I was one of the not the first Uber and Lyft drivers, but I got started driving for Uber and Lyft about 7 years ago, which in rideshare years is a hell of a long time. Most people don't last that long, and don't even come close to lasting that long. I think Uber released a stat that said 2/3 of all drivers quit after just 6 months, just to put things in perspective. And so really, I think what you saw at the beginning was that this was new, this was sexy. Consumers obviously loved Uber. And on the driver's side, you could really earn a lot of money. And I think this is actually typical, not just to Uber, but with new services in general, right? When they, especially ones that are well funded, right? When they're brand new, they obviously need to build, especially marketplace businesses, they need to build up that supply. And so they pay more, or they offer hourly bonuses, or the rates are higher. And so that's really what we saw at the beginning, is that drivers could earn more. I remember going out, and actually one of the first podcasts I did was that's still listenable, although I don't know how relevant it is since it's 7 years old. But I talked about how I was earning $50 an hour driving on July 4th, and that was in Newport Beach, California. And really, what we've seen over the years is I think rates have clearly come down. And I personally feel that the positives still outweigh the negatives across the entire gig economy. And I mean, probably not a shock, because my whole business is built around that. You wouldn't be able to build a really successful business if you hated the gig economy and, thought that it was the worst job in the world. But I do think a lot of those lingering issues, the negatives parts, are still around. And for some drivers, I think they're able to figure it out and make it work for them. And for others, I think that they're not able to figure out. And that's why so many churn. So, in a nutshell, I think that's kind of the progression we've seen, as, rates kind of coming down, more positives and negatives. But still there's millions of people now working in the gig economy. So I guess what I would say at a high level, it obviously can't be that bad if millions of people are doing it over many other jobs.
Right. I've been driving out here for 6 years plus.
All right.
I mean, I haven't drove during the pandemic. I didn't do
Yeah.
it. And I think that we talked a long time back, and that I do a lot of production work too. So for me, rideshare isn't just supplemental weekly income. It's more like, if I go on the road with Shania Twain and do a European tour for 6 weeks and come
Yeah.
back for 3 weeks, what do I do during those 3 weeks?
Yeah.
Because nobody would hire me and
Right.
let me take 6 weeks off.
Yeah. And I think actually that's really the perfect microcosm of the positive outweighing the negative, right? I mean, I think obviously, number one complaint from every driver and every gig worker is low rates. They don't make enough. And I have to say, I hate to break it to people, this is actually true across pretty much every job you're ever going to have. Everyone wants to get paid more. Everyone always thinks that they're not paid enough, not to, sort of make light of that fact, but definitely, that's a common, I guess you would say, complaint. And it's pretty big one in the gig economy. But at the same time, that's why I'm such a fan of the gig economy, because regardless of the pay, there's literally no job in the planet that would allow you to do what you just described right there.
Exactly. And I do other things too. And so for me to flex time it, and for me to be able to have that flex to make my own schedule.
Mhm.
And I mean, I know my city, you know your city. So in my city, I can pick up the Westward or whatever, see what's going on. And yeah, a
Yeah.
lot of times in the past, I've had to accommodate my life, my son's life. You have kids too.
Yep.
I've had to accommodate our life around kind of missing a lot of stuff
Yeah.
because to make money in this, I mean, I've been in the service industry for 25 years,
Yeah.
bartending, all kinds of stuff. So, I mean, like, that's just kind of something that either people are meant to, they're either able to be in that industry or they're not.
Yeah.
And I don't think a lot of people catch on with relating service industry to rideshare sometimes.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point about the relation between service industry and rideshare. And I mean, it's really kind of what my whole business, we've got a couple courses for drivers on rideshare and now delivery that we just launched. And, that's really like a lot of the videos and a lot of the training that we do, and even articles and, everything that we're releasing, like dealing with passengers. A lot of this is de-escalation, right? Like we've seen a bunch of safety incidents in the past, probably 6 months. And of course, these are terrible. Like some of these are really bad, really scary. And I'm here driving in LA. I'm 6'3", 200 pounds. Like there have been many times where I've picked up or dropped off people and been a little, sort of sketched out. Like, hey, this seems pretty shady. This seems pretty scary. So imagine if you're someone smaller or a female, or, so you can very easily see how some of these situations can be scary. But at the same time, if you've worked in service industry, you understand, right? Like, hey, you can how to de-escalate a situation, right? Like you don't want to drop someone off on the side of the road in the middle of a freeway if you're going to kick a passenger out. You do it in a well-lit area. You do it in front of a police station. There are de-escalation strategies and training. And actually that, like if you've worked in a big, sort of like hotel chain in the service industry, like they do this type of training. And, in the gig economy, you legally cannot get training from your employers because you are independent contractors. And so I think that's really, I think that's kind of the crux. And this is training specifically, but it sort of flows out to many other responsibilities that you have as a gig worker, whether you realize it or not. You kind of need to understand de-escalation training. You need to understand your taxes. You need to understand your insurance, and we can go on and on. But I think that's sometimes a challenge. And just to be frank, like a lot of people get into the gig economy looking to make a couple $100 a week, yet they now have all the reporting and sort of business requirements of an actual business owner. And I think that running a business is hard, so it's not for everyone. And I think it's a little difficult sometimes to tell someone like, hey, you're not a good fit for this gig. But that really kind of is the reality, and not all situations, but I would say some situations for sure.
I'd say almost all. I mean, we got
Yeah, and I mean,
85% of the gig economy wants to be flex.
yeah.
Only 15 wants to be full time, and those who fight for the full time and the AB5 type PROACT type passages,
Mhm.
it's always been very odd to me that they want to fight for minimum wage and health benefits
Yeah.
for a company they hate when they can walk out the door right now and have a job that starts this evening with those two things.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's, one thing I've always seen that I think is an interesting phenomenon is there's sort of this barbell effect when it comes to tenure of drivers, right? You have a lot of new drivers because the companies are always hiring, people are always quitting. And so they need a whole bunch of new drivers. And you have a lot of veteran drivers. I mean, it's funny when we do our annual survey, I mean, we have people that I just got an email from this guy named John. I won't share his last name, but I literally just read it. He's driving in Boston and he's like, oh, I've got 15,000 rides. I've got all my strategies down. I'm earning $40 an hour. And I said, wow, this sounds great. Come write a guest post for me. And he said, he already replied back to me, right? So it's just sort of, it's one email, one example, right? But like you do have a lot of people who figure it out and they figure out their strategies. And, then I think you have some people in the middle, but it really does seem like, if you can figure out the gig economy, again, right? Like I'm not trying to hype up the gig economy and saying everyone needs to do it and it's the most amazing job in the world. But I do think it's pretty clear that if you can figure out this job, it's better than a lot of other comparable jobs out there.
I agree. And I think that, I mean, with 1/3 of, and this includes, we've had guests on the podcast who are not app based or on demand platform gig workers, but they're true gig workers. We've
Yeah.
had, we had a nonprofit opera house in LA
Oh,
where you
cool.
are. And she's now shut down because of AB5.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, well, the
so but
AB, yeah, the AB5 is sort of its own mess. I don't know how much you want to get into it, but yeah,
no,
definitely
I
that's sort
don't
of
know.
where
I really, we've touched on it a bunch.
I know.
I'm just pointing
I
out
think
that
I saw
one
you
third of
you
the
had a few.
workforce
Yeah,
is gig economy. Now it's
definitely.
not all app based. It's not
Yeah,
all, but they seem to be coming together a little more. I
yeah.
mean, more and more app based stuff, and it
Hmm.
does seem to be bringing all of these freelancers and gig economy type people together. And I think we're going to see more of that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's actually a good point because, I mean, really, when you think about the definition of the gig economy, for me, the gig economy actually is a lot more focused on app-based work, right? What enables that flexibility, that on-demand onboarding, that on-demand pay. I mean, what are the services where you can basically work almost whenever and wherever you want, and when you're done, cash out that pay instantly, right? A lot of the more traditional, staffing jobs and some of these freelancing jobs are really nothing like that, right? I mean,
Right.
you kind of can pick some jobs here and there, but it's not like you can open an app and work whenever and wherever you want, right? I think of gig economy as much more technologically based, right? Usually through an app or a website, but so companies, obviously Uber and Lyft, I think are in that category, food delivery, grocery delivery. And I think over the past year, what's really exploded are these last mile services, a lot of which we've tried to feature recently on the podcast, just a couple on my podcast that we've talked about. Curry is an on-demand, it's kind of like an Uber for on-demand construction materials, right? There's Point Pickup, right, which is another one, right? So there's all these sort of like what I think of last mile delivery companies, and that seems to really have exploded. I mean, even like Amazon Flex, for example, I think of that as gig economy, or it
Yeah,
is definitely gig
absolutely.
economy. But those types of driving jobs where you're selecting your shifts using an app, kind of working on demand, and that kind of nature for sure. So freelancing, is probably one level up, but encompasses more people, and that's kind of what you were talking about with AB5. I think it was actually targeted at gig economy and maybe even specifically, Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, and Instacart and Postmates, but it affected a whole bunch of other freelancers, which I don't think of as being in the traditional gig economy, which, to be fair, like they may have their own set of issues, but definitely it's a very different type of, sort of job, I guess you would say. And also, I would
Oh,
say
absolutely.
regulatory wise, you want to apply probably pretty different rules.
Absolutely. I mean, and you can look at any one of the spectrums. I mean, like when I was doing the Opera House, I looked at these, and a lot of times these people are paid for 4 days worth of gigs, so that makes it
Hmm.
very rough for them.
Yeah.
So I'm not. We definitely base more on the app-based gig economy as well. I
Hmm.
just am kind of trying to speculate and look ahead because I think that we're going to see more and more freelance type jobs or apps or things of that nature to get around things. No, I don't think the Pro Act's going to pass.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that whatever that takes, even if it comes down to a filibuster or whatever it might take, I just don't think they have it. It's definitely closer than it's ever been.
Hmm.
I'm surprised that they use AB5 as their model. And again,
Yeah.
I won't tread on this too long. I just think we're going to see some merging of the traditional gig economy
Yeah.
with the
So
more
I think if
on-demand
you look at,
app-based.
yeah, I think if you look at a lot of the sort of, more futuristic surveys and studies that have been done, by the think tanks to get paid millions of dollars to sort of ideate in the sky, they typically say, okay, this percentage of the economy is shifting to freelance, like everything's going to freelance, everything's going to gig economy. And I think that there's some truth behind that for sure. I don't know, talking about the future of rideshare and the gig economy, I don't think we're that close, in the next 5 or 10 years, lawyers, doctors, everyone's going to be using
No,
an
no,
app to
no,
get
no.
their next job or their next
Right.
work. I really don't think we're that close to
No,
that,
no, no.
in the next 5, 10, or even 20 years. But I do think that, understanding, right, like the benefits of employers hiring independent contractors versus employees and how that benefits the companies. I mean, that's kind of what we saw in California with some delivery companies, or sorry, some, what do you call them? Grocery chains, for example, kind of outsourcing now to independent contractors instead of employees once, sort of Prop 22 and things like that pass. I mean, basically, it's just the gist is that, I think it's a lot cheaper for companies to hire independent contractors and, sort of, I think more benefits accrue accrue to the employers. And so I do think we are going to see sort of a slow to medium kind of shifting towards that type of employment.
Yeah, I actually fully agree with all of that. So I'm looking here at my notes on. Okay, so you mentioned coming when we first started about the passengers are coming back, the drivers aren't. I think we
Mhm.
all know that the pandemic aid is playing a role in that.
Yep.
Um, I think that safety, even though most are vaccinated and whatnot, I think that being mask police is still a big issue.
Yeah.
I mean, I talk to drivers all the time, and they are still having masking issues. And like you were saying,
Yeah.
de-escalating, like, dude, that
I
can turn
mean,
into a fight very quickly.
right. Well, especially with mask, which has been kind of politicized, in the first place. And then now you have a lot of people who are vaccinated and still being required to wear a mask. And so you can kind of imagine that you get into this really big gray area where now it's kind of on drivers to enforce this policy, which maybe scientifically, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Why, if I'm a passenger, it's not hard for me to argue, okay, I get this is policy, but, I'm vaccinated. Why do I have to wear a mask? Here's my vaccination card, right? And if a driver really wants to follow the rules, then they kind of need to tell them to wear a mask. But so, it's a tricky situation, right? Which, drivers probably would say they're not paid enough to handle. And that's, I think, like you said, I mean, for as far as why drivers aren't coming back, I think it's pretty obvious that unemployment, PPP, ERC, employee retention credit, which we've talked about, that's a lesser known one, is having a big impact on drivers right now. I mean, there was an article by the Washington Post that said Uber drivers, specifically Uber drivers, were the number one recipient of idle grants, these $1,000 grants. Out of all the people that receive $1,000 idle grants, the most popular profession was Uber driver, just to put things in perspective. And I feel in small part we may have contributed to that, because I think we had a video that had like 300,000 or 400,000 views on how to claim this, one thing. It was basically $1,000 of free money. So I think that's the number one reason. And then, like you said, there are some secondary reasons. I think probably the second biggest reason, though, is that a lot of people have switched over to delivery, either because at the
Oh yeah.
beginning of pandemic, they, at the beginning of the pandemic, rideshare demand went off the cliff. There were no rides for anyone. There was COVID issues, right? Like
In
you
one
said,
day.
in one day, right? And
In
so
one
a
day,
lot of
literally. Yeah.
folks switched over to delivery. The delivery companies, I mean, DoorDash is a $50 billion company right now. I just interviewed the president of their company. And I mean, it's pretty amazing the stats that he was listing off, $2.5, I think, $billion they paid their dashers last year. They've got 2 million dashers right now. So delivery companies are like real competitors to Uber and Lyft now at the end of the pandemic. Whereas before, I don't think you could even put DoorDash in the same class or category as an Uber or even a Lyft. So I think, you've got more competition, more people moving over to delivery. And then some of those secondary reasons would be things like COVID safety, or, it's just,
Yeah.
like having to enforce that. Or even like I've seen a lot of these, for whatever reason over the past 6 months or so, viral videos of drivers being attacked by passengers or having to deal with it. So I
Yeah.
feel like there's definitely some smaller or more secondary reasons, but those would be the two big ones in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, as you know, I work with the guys at Para, so I did watch
Yeah.
the DoorDash video because I
Oh,
was
okay,
very
cool.
interested to see how he was going to state that. I think you were doing a great job at picking his brain. I think he tried to, you know, do his best, but I think that it's important for everybody listening to understand that what do we all want as drivers and gig workers?
Yeah.
We want good money. We want to make good money. So what do these companies want? Good money. Now
Yeah.
we all call them the rich and the elites, and they take too much, but we're really all doing the same thing. We just want more money. um
Yeah. And I
the
mean, I
tip
think, what were you
Go
saying?
ahead.
No,
No, go
I
ahead.
think that that's a good point. It's something that I try to instill in a lot of people is that, in general, right, you see these stories, oh, some guy worked for this company for 10, 20 years and then gets laid off. Like that happens when you're an employee and when you've been really loyal. In the gig economy, it's like that times 10, right? Like there's no loyalty on either side of the equation, to be frank. Drivers are driving for whoever, will pay them the most at the time. And companies, I think, sort of think, basically the opposite, right? They're trying to get workers for as cheap as possible. So if you understand that, right, like the way I tell drivers and gig workers is no one cares more about your money. No one cares more about your job than you do, right? It doesn't mean you have to do everything you can to screw over the company you're working for, but just understand at the end of the day, right? Like they don't always have your best interest at heart, right? There are certain actions or things that they may ask you to do that are not in your best interest. And it's not that you need to say no every single time, but you need to understand that, right? So if a trip comes in and they're sending you trips, that trip isn't necessarily the best trip for you to take in that moment at that time, and according to even your schedule, your personal schedule, or what you have, what your goals are for that day, right? So as long as you understand that, then you can make more informed decisions. And I think that if you really kind of take that principle and then apply it to many different areas of work life as a gig worker, you can have a lot more success than just sort of, kind of assuming that everyone is on the same team and everyone has the same incentives, because frankly,
Right.
I'm not trying to sound gloom and doom, right? But just the incentives aren't quite aligned at all times.
Right. And I mean, like, when you talk about delivery, look at all the delivery platforms. You can name any one of them: Grubhub,
Yeah.
Eats, DoorDash, any of them pre-pandemic. They were
Yeah.
all doing horribly.
Yeah.
And drivers, or at least delivery
Well,
drivers that I talked to, were doing just horribly in most
yeah, I
markets.
guess I would say push back that it depends on your definition of horribly, right? I think that a lot of people have got it into their head that, okay, like you said, right, like all of these gig companies are, rich and making billions and all that, and there's definitely, a certain not percentage, but there's certain, I guess you would say, like people or groups involved with these companies that are doing very well. Early investors, probably early employees, and probably even current employees. But that's why it's interesting to think about, like, the companies themselves are not profitable, right? It's
No.
not like, Uber. People obviously love to complain about the take rate of Uber, on rides, and the take rate. Restaurants obviously feel that Postmates and DoorDash take way too much money. Drivers feel that they're not making enough. And so when you think about it on that unit, what they would call a unit economics basis, right? Like the companies aren't profitable, basically, right? That doesn't mean that they're not rich and that, a lot of people haven't
Oh yeah.
made billions of dollars. But I think it's just important to understand that, because, it really gets at the heart of the equation, right? If Uber is taking 30% of every single trip, there's a reason for that. It's not necessarily because they're greedy. It's because insurance is really damn expensive. The marketing is really expensive. Hiring all the drivers, that have quit and paying them new bonuses, right? Or sign on or whatever it might be, is expensive. And some of these are more self-inflicted wounds than others, and they could do a better job, right? And so it's easy for them to say, oh, it's so expensive for this, but that's because they did a crappy job at, something else. But I do think it is just sort of, important to balance that. And I think that's kind of what, I was trying to get at in some of these interviews with my like the executives, like the DoorDash president, for example, because at an individual driver level, I don't think about any of that crap, right? I just want the best trip that's the best for me in the moment. And I totally get that. And that's kind of how I am the exact same way too. In the moment, I want to maximize my income, but it's really tough. And I'm not saying that drivers even need to worry about, I think the companies need to do a better job figuring this out. Like, how do you connect what's happening on an individual level with the fact that, like, if we all only take the best rides and best deliveries, then the customers start getting screwed, and then they start using the services less. And I think that's where a lot of these gig companies have really struggled figuring out that balance. It's like they either give too much or they take too much, right? And like, if the companies have all the power, then they kind of tilt it more towards their side. And I think that's typically what we've seen, is it usually things kind of work out in the favor of the companies over the years.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think that obviously 6+ years in rideshare, I've seen all the dips. I saw it go
Yeah.
from my straight split, and here in Denver when they first came around, I went with Lyft first. I don't know why. I think a friend signed me up.
Mhm.
But I went with Lyft first, and it was like 85-15. It was like the
Yeah.
best percentage I've ever seen. And then it went to 80-20. When I got onto Uber shortly after, it was 80-20.
Mhm.
Then we saw the different things that have happened. But when they finally got down to being transparent with receipts through the app a few years back, here in Denver anyway, and I know this from other markets too, but here in Denver especially, things were so dynamically priced for what Uber was taking. It was amazing.
Yeah.
It's like, I know I'm supposed to just base it on, here's my miles, here's my time, this, that,
Yeah.
the other. Don't worry about the rest. Is there a surge? That's all you can know. But
Yeah.
now I wanted to see the receipt. So when you see the receipt and you look at them back to back and you're like, 28, 30%, 62%,
Yeah.
22%, 58. I think that was one of the most annoying times in
Yeah.
the rideshare game for me, because I was like, this is
Yeah.
ridiculous.
Well, and I think that's a perfect example of where the companies really struggle. I mean, so Dara, I don't know if you responded to my thread the other day, but Dara released this tweet storm the other day, talking about the take rate that they've been taking from drivers, because there was a Washington Post article that basically said, because what the passenger pays is uncoupled from what the driver gets, right? A driver on a surge ride might get a $25 base plus only a $5 flat rate surge now in every market in the US, right? But the passenger might pay $100 for that trip. So that trip is going to be, one of those 70% take rates. And what Dara was basically replying and saying is that I looked at the numbers on average, our take rate has actually gone down over the past quarter. And this is, according to him. And I don't think he has any real reason to lie, but I think it kind of highlights, like, Uber is basically saying right now that they're actually, that percentage that they take on average from drivers is going down. But if you ask drivers, they would say the exact opposite, right? They would say, oh, Uber takes 60%, Uber takes 50%. Their take rate has
Right,
gone
right.
up over the years. And frankly, we really don't know, right? We've done this analysis a few times in the past, and their take rate has kind of hovered always in that 30 to 40% range when you account for their commission and the service fee, right? Because the service fee is now up to $3, right? So if you kind of look at it like from just pure math, right? Like on a $10 ride that the passenger pays, they take a $3 service fee off the top. That leaves with $7. And in kind of a traditional 75-25 split, I'm simplifying here, but this is the gist of how
Right.
the math works. The driver gets 75% of that $7, which I'm totally have no idea what it is, but $5, let's say, something of that order. And then, on that trip, Uber's take rate, which, is going to be, so on a shorter trip, right, their take rate is close to 50%, right? And so there are trips where their take rate is really high, and it's very easy for drivers to sort of only focus on those, right? They don't look at the trips where Uber loses money or the take rate is a lot lower. And again, like, I totally empathize with that. I wouldn't blame them at all. I would probably do the same thing. But I feel like, again, the companies, don't do the greatest job connecting or, being transparent with that information. And, typically if they're not transparent with that information, that should be telling you something. It means they probably, the information isn't good. They're probably taking, a lot more, right? Like, the fact that Dara went and reviewed all this data and now he's tweeting about it instead of sharing it in the past or giving it to this Washington Post reporter. I don't know. It like seems a little fishy to me. I'm not like a conspiracy theory, but
There was
it's sort
one
of,
part of that tweet, in fact, where he said, I can't remember specifically what it said, but it was something alluding to, I'm going to have to go ask about that.
yeah.
And in my head, I'm thinking, maybe for exact specific numbers, but dude, you
Yeah.
what's going on. You didn't need to go.
Yeah.
I thought that was really kind of actually a little rude to even put in that tweet to drivers
Well,
anyway, that see that, because it was like, dude, that's an extra slap. I mean,
yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. No, I
Because we
think
all
I'm
know that
sure.
I mean, if he didn't understand it, he wouldn't be in the position he's in.
Well, I will say, yeah. Well, I think he would and he wouldn't, right? Because you imagine, right? Like, and that's actually, I've interviewed Dara twice now, and I will say the
Right.
first time I interviewed him was at a driver event in person in LA. Obviously, this must have been before the pandemic, and I will say, like, we got into some, because I sort of knew, like, okay, obviously, I got to ask this guy about, why don't they pay drivers enough, and kind of go down that rabbit hole, of course, right? In my first interview with him, and I will say, I was impressed at just how much level of details he did know in that first interview. Like, you think about it, like, this guy's the CEO of a 70-80 billion dollar company. Drivers are one piece, riders are one piece, Uber Eats is another piece. Like, there's a lot going on. I would imagine, I've never been CEO of a company like Uber, but I imagine there's a lot going on. And I was impressed in that first interview with him by the level of detail he did know. And maybe he was prepped for the interview, maybe he wasn't, but I will say that I was like, oh, I'm kind of surprised that he knows this level of detail. And I actually, in this recent tweet storm, I kind of felt the opposite. I felt that he didn't know that much level of detail, because the way, what the Washington Post article was describing was that flat rate surge that I just explained, right? Like, that you are
Yeah.
probably familiar with. And why it's very confusing was I won't go into the whole history, but basically in California, they got rid of it after AB5 passed to make it seem more in California only, make it seem like drivers are more independent, which was probably a smart thing to do because it does actually, make, connect things more. And then once Prop 22 passed, they brought it back. And so,
Right. Yeah.
it like, frankly, I think the timeline is confusing and how it works is also very confusing. And that was kind of one of the things I tweeted out, like, hey, if the CEO of Uber can't even understand how drivers are paid on an individual versus aggregate level, like, imagine what your average driver is thinking. And that's again why, with some of these issues, I do think it's important to highlight, like, hey, what are the downsides of abusing this feature or doing that? But I also 100% think that it's on the responsibility of these companies to figure out how best to sort of communicate that to drivers, or to sort of ensure that they're following the rules and not abusing. I don't think it's on the driver's side, but hey, it might be interesting for people to know.
Yeah. I just think something's gonna have to change to bring the me's back. The people like me and the veteran drivers who
Yeah.
even have been through all the highs and lows, because we've seen flat rate turn to multiplier, turn to flat rate to
Yeah.
multiplier, back and forth, which always has been an indicator to me, because I've been able to watch that when they did multiplier and went to flat rate, but then they went back, it always was at a time when there was less drivers.
Yeah. Hmm.
Here in Denver anyway. In our market,
Interesting.
multiplier would come back when the drivership was down.
Hmm.
And I always thought that was a little odd, because we all love the multiplier.
Yeah. Well, and I think that definitely, I'll be honest, like the U's, the Stevens that are the veteran drivers, and, maybe even the me's, although I'm not really driving that much these days. I did go out for a 3 for $100 bonus. It was a little too good to pass up recently. So thank you,
Yep.
Dara and Uber, for that quick $100. But I think the veteran drivers, frankly, aren't coming back. I don't know that there's much Uber and Lyft can do to get those veteran drivers back, because for two reasons. I think number one, if you've sort of seen higher pay, if you've seen a better system, you've sort of seen the light, right? You know what it's like to drive with 6 destination filters before they dropped it down to 2, or to drive with higher rates, or, all of the things that have been changed, the multiplier versus flat rate surge, versus a brand new driver who's coming onto the system. They don't know what it used to be like, right? And so
Right.
I think that that's a challenge there. And actually, a good example of this would be what we saw in New York City. So they instituted
With you.
a
Yeah.
minimum wage in New York City for drivers that ended up, they released data in New York City from the TLC, because it's a highly regulated UberX market, and drivers are making way more money because they did a pretty smart minimum wage based off utilization, right? So drivers kind of have to stay busy. But what that means is that the companies and the drivers' utilization rate, that utilization rate is now incentivized, right? You can't go out and sit there and not get any trips, because Uber's going to have to pay you, a minimum wage, right? And so what they do is they have sort of a semi-scheduling. You have to drive in certain times in certain places. You still get to select blocks, and there's some
Yep.
flexibility. It's actually very similar to how DoorDash works, for example, with their scheduling shifts. And frankly, like, drivers freaking hated this. They did not like scheduling shifts. They did not like scheduling blocks, even though it was sort of awarded, priority was awarded to the best, the most loyal, the highest rated drivers, which kind of
Yep.
makes sense.
Which
Obviously,
makes sense. It just left a lot of people out.
right. But, obviously, if you're an employer,
But I
you're
mean,
not going to give, like,
that's how it is. I mean,
right, you're not going to give
that's
the shittiest workers, the most unreliable workers, the best shifts, right? Like, duh.
right. Well,
But why it was so interesting to me is because DoorDash has been like that since day one. 7 years ago, when I did my first dash in Orange County, it was a Raising Cane's fried chicken place. I had to schedule my shift. And you don't really hear drivers complain about those scheduled shifts like you did with this outrage with Uber and Lyft, because it was new, right? Because they were used to this old system, right? And so you can kind of see that, like, hey, I think that system could work. It still provides for some flexibility, but because you really don't need the ability to log on whenever and wherever you want. You're not going to go do one trip and then log off, right? There's certain
right.
flexibility that you could lose, and you wouldn't actually mind, right? But it does matter. whether you got that in the first place or not. And I think that's another thing. I'm sort of, man, I hope I get paid by this interview from Uber and Lyft and all these gig economy companies. I'm giving them a lot of good advice, but that's the other thing that I feel like they've really missed out on and they don't understand, right? Because they're doing all these A/B tests and, like the perfect example, which relates to the DoorDash interview. And, I think we wanted to talk about this, but, Uber, for example, they gave drivers in California the ability to see destination, and they gave drivers the ability to see the fare and some other details, like and they didn't realize that some drivers would abuse this. I literally was like, oh my god, how dumb can you guys be? Like, of course some drivers are going to sit there and decline 99 trips until they get that one trip that they want, right? They could have put like some basic guardrails in place, like, hey, what they ended up settling on, I actually think makes a lot of sense. Like, you can see the last 5, or you can see the destination as long as you've accepted 5 out of the last 10 trips. Like, okay, you could argue over that number, but it's at least reasonable.
Well, I think that's fair. I mean, if you're not
Yeah.
accepting 5 out of 10, you're not.
I know.
You're
Like, it's
you're
not
just
even
cherry
that.
picking. You're just cherry
Right.
picking from your couch. You're not even just
Right.
cherry picking.
It's not
You're
even
doing it
that
from home.
high of a bar, but the fact that they released the feature, like a free for all at the start, a bunch of people abused it. Like, duh, obviously that was going to happen. How did they not? They've done so many releases like this where like people end up abusing it. And then when they go back to 5 out of 10, now all the drivers are pissed at them. And so if they would have just originally launched, something in the nature of 5 out of 10, I think it would have been a much smarter experiment, if that makes sense. And that's kind of what gets rid of like some of those veteran drivers, or gets rid of those other people that I just feel like they're not quite seeing. And I think it's kind of interesting for me because I've been doing this for 7 years, so I could point to like 6 different examples of that they've done like this over 7 years. But a lot of the people working at these companies are not there for more than 2 or maybe 4 years, because they get stock vested over 4 years usually. So a lot of them aren't there for longer than 1, 2, 3, 4, even 4 years. And so I feel like what's that famous saying? Those who do not remember history are doomed to repeat it. And that definitely seems to be happening here.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I do know a lot of rideshare drivers who pivoted to delivery.
Yeah.
Right, end of April or end of March, start of April last year, like almost
Definitely.
to that day when it went dead. They were just like, okay, well, I'm not going to be fully done. I'm just going to go over to delivery. I know a lot of them are happy, right, and have been happy for the year. I mean, that was able to happen and that it blew up so big, the
Mm-hmm.
delivery space. But I know a good handful of them that kind of, I know some that don't, but I know a good handful that miss the people,
Yeah.
believe it or not. And would actually like to see, be able to go back to rideshare, but they're still not there. I mean, and
Yeah.
I think that with everything reopening, I think delivery is going to do great, especially compared to how it's always done or
Mm-hmm.
did pre-pandemic. I mean, maybe it'll be a slight decline, but I think people they're enjoying it now. They're in the groove of using it, just like when Uber and Lyft came around.
Mm-hmm.
Took a while, took a
Yeah.
few minutes for people to get on board with that, but I think they're on board. But I think that there's going to be an oversaturation of delivery drivers. I think we're going to
Yeah.
see some percentage of that be lopped off a bit.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's, we can
Which
definitely
might cause a reback pivot
yeah.
to rideshare, but people are going to want that. Why should I go back to rideshare? And these are the people I'm talking about specifically. I talk to people all the time, but
Mm-hmm.
who do gig work. But I mean, like, I'm talking about specifically the drivers I'd want,
Yeah. So
like the best out there.
yeah. Well, so there's never been a lot of crossover between rideshare and delivery. And that's sort of always been something that's surprised me. I think that a lot of people either get into rideshare or they get in delivery, or they try one and switch to the other, or they try rideshare and switch to delivery. And there aren't a lot of people who are like, I go out and drive Uber and DoorDash, for example. And that's kind of like my thing, so we found like in our surveys that maybe 10 to 20% of drivers are kind of like dual apping in that delivery and rideshare space. And even then, some of them might like occasionally turn on Uber Eats. And there are some good strategies. If you're an Uber driver, you flip on Uber Eats if you happen, at the end of your shift, if you happen to be near the destination that, like your house, for example, because you're never going to get, never, but, you might most likely will not get a 25-mile, food delivery order, right? It's going to be in a smaller radius. So it's sort of like a mini destination filter. So there's some good strategies that you can use between rideshare and delivery, but there's actually, to be a delivery driver, there's much fewer requirements, right? Your vehicle is a number one tool as a driver, and you can basically drive with any old piece of shit on delivery, right? It could be a bike, it could be a scooter,
Wow.
you could walk, you could drive with a friend, a family member. Like I do, I started doing Instacart during the pandemic, and also because I have two kids and I'm lazy. But and I'd be surprised, like maybe 10% of people drop off, 10 to 20% of people drop off with someone else, like they go and shop with someone else and then drop off with someone else. And I see the same phenomenon on food delivery, maybe a little bit less, but like 5 to 15% of people do it as a team with a partner, a spouse, girlfriend, whoever, kids, I've even seen kids, whoever it may be. So on the delivery side, there's just a lot less requirements. So I think they have a bigger potential pool of applicants. And I think that's been emphasized during the pandemic. Instacart, DoorDash have announced that they've hired hundreds of thousands of drivers. DoorDash, the president in my interview with him, he cited that they have 2 million dashers on the platform right now. Like that, those are like Uber like numbers. Right. And if you think about it, like these delivery services have been, at the beginning of the pandemic when demand was crazy, they were struggling, and Instacart was, 1 to 2 days or, whatever it might be. But within a few months, they really figured out their supply issues pretty quickly. They hired enough drivers, even as demand was spiking. And I was listening to one of the earnings calls that DoorDash CEO Tony Xu did, and that's exactly what he said, is that early on we had some issues and then we figured it out. And I started thinking about it like, wow, food delivery companies have really not had that same supply and labor shortage. Like I order delivery all the time, for the reasons I mentioned, and because it's sort of my job to investigate a lot of these services. And like the food delivery companies have been very reliable compared to Uber and Lyft. I've been calling rides all the time on Uber and Lyft over the past year, and it's been like the crappiest service, as many people have noted. But food delivery, so there's some differences in the kind of labor pool and the requirements too.
Yeah, I agree. I just wonder, once that saturation and people start, because what we're talking about today, where does rideshare go? To be honest, it's what are they going to go back to the model of just onboard everybody and just keep them coming in? If they're here for a week, they're only here for a week, because they've ran through quite a bit of the population.
So good point. And I would say two-part answer. I think number one, I kind of early on in my, and you've been doing this for 6 years too. I'm curious if you have changed your tune, because early on in my career, in the first few years of blogging at the Rideshare Guy, that was kind of my line, is like, they can only do this for so long before they burn the bridges, before they start going through all the workforce. And I think at a certain point, like in my second, third, or fourth year of covering the industry, I decided like, holy moly, I was completely wrong on this, or at least in my opinion, I was wrong. Like, I think there's just so many potential workers out there. There's so many people, 300 plus million in the United States, right? That like, I don't know if they're ever, going to burn through their bridges, and that they ever kind of like tap out that market. And I think, right now, like thinking about it right now, most people, I think, are not coming back to ride hail because of unemployment. That's a temporary situation. There are other reasons that we've talked about, right? But that's, I think, one of the, if not the main one. So I feel like this is actually a temporary blip for rideshare. In the next 3 to 4 months, as unemployment starts to wane, I think about 20 to 25, mainly Republican states, have stopped accepting additional unemployment. So, in those states, which are frankly not the bigger markets for Uber and Lyft. So I don't know how much of it, but you can sort of see the trend is going that way. I think that Uber and Lyft supply issues will sort of resolve themselves on their own in the next 3 to 4 months. And we will see that, people are going to be coming back to ride hail. And I do think on the delivery side, I think it might even be a little more extreme. I'm not as convinced that the value proposition on the customer side is like as amazing as it is on Uber and Lyft, right? Like on Uber and Lyft, as a customer, it's like, wow, I want to go get blasted with my friends tonight. I call, tap a ride, and I go there and I don't get a DUI, or none of my friends want to drive, right? Like the solution to the problem there is so much better than in food delivery, where like, hey, I can cook my own food. I can buy groceries. I can go pick up my own food. I can not eat tonight, right? Like there's so many, the problem or the solution with food delivery to the problem is not as meaningful. And that's sort of why I've always felt strongly that, like, as a driver, and I think the data pretty clearly backs this up, especially in the surveys we've done, like rideshare drivers typically earn on average $15 to $20 an hour before expenses. Whereas food delivery before the pandemic was more in the $10 to $15 an hour range before expenses. And the expenses are probably a little less because you can drive, any old car, right? So it doesn't have to be a nicer or newer car. You can use a scooter, a motorcycle, etc. And the miles you put on your car are definitely going to be less, as not a crazy amount, but they will be less, as a food delivery versus rideshare. But I think the pandemic has kind of messed with that, obviously. And I think right now, or we don't need to go through the whole history of the earnings, but I would say, like, going forward, I do think we're going to return to a state where rideshare drivers is kind of like rideshare driving is the clear, or if not clear, like definitely most people realize that you can make more money driving for Uber and Lyft than you can doing food delivery. And I think right now that is the case. I just don't know if it's as clear, right? Or people have maybe gotten used to doing delivery driving. And so they're like, oh, yeah, I could probably make a few bucks more with Uber, but, I'm going to just stick with delivery. I feel like it's just going to be that transition is going to be a little slower than the rideshare companies want it to be.
Well, I think when the pandemic aid ends, um, I would hope. I mean, to me anyway, that's a perfect time for Uber and Lyft to, even if it's not something monumental, huge, that's a time for them to put a campaign together, do a little bump for driver pay. I
Yeah.
mean, right before there anyway, right as people understand PUA is ending.
Yeah.
And, it might, I don't know. I mean, I know they work like this, and it seems like it'd be a really good chance for them to bring some people back because, that's another thing is canceled rides. I keep hearing
Yeah.
about that. New drivers just, I mean, it's like it's so hard to get a ride. And here in
Yeah.
Denver, we do pretty good earnings because not a lot of, we have a good demographic between 25 and 35,
Hmm.
and not a lot of them own cars, oddly.
Yeah.
They just rely on transportation, and a lot of them make a six-figure income out here.
Yeah.
So
Well, and the canceled ride thing is actually interesting because, so like I said, I've actually been calling a ride every weekday because we've had a nanny come over to watch my son, and she stopped taking the bus. And so, she needed an Uber. So I've like experienced it firsthand from the passenger side. And then of course I've also seen it from the driver's side from doing it myself and, talking to so many drivers. But I think that the canceled ride is actually a good example where, on the passenger side, like they see drivers are canceling all the time. Like, why is that happening? Okay, I'm a driver. I'm used to getting, 3 to 5 minute ETA pickups in Los Angeles. And now I'm getting them, because there aren't as many drivers. There's lots of passengers. I'm getting 10 to 15 minutes out, right? Like, I don't, maybe there's some, you sort of do get paid for that time now in some places, but for the most part, you don't get a lot of money. Let's call it, just to keep the discussion simple. You don't really get paid for driving to that passenger. And so, now that driver is only looking for the shorter ETAs, right? And so you can imagine that experience, is now worse for the passenger. And it's kind of like a never-ending cycle. I literally, here in LA, right? Like, imagine you're struggling to call a ride as a passenger. So now you call both Uber and Lyft, right? Because you can't get a ride, and this is literally in Los Angeles. I do this every day. I have to call both an Uber and Lyft. It might take 5 to 10 minutes to match with a driver who is then sometimes they're 3 minutes away, sometimes they're 15 minutes away, right? And when they're 3 minutes away, it's almost sometimes like too fast, right? Because I called it like 20 minutes. I don't need it for 20 minutes because it's normally
right.
15 or 20 minutes to get a ride. And so you can sort of see how, like, I wouldn't blame one side or the other, but there's all these like kind of back and forth situations that like really start to deteriorate the marketplace. And it's funny because it also kind of is one of my number one tips for new gig workers, whether you're doing rideshare or delivery, is to try these services from the platform. You may not need to order a ride or order food every day like I do, but even at least once or twice, you really kind of start to see from the passenger's point of view, and kind of really help inform. And like going back to our running a good business discussion, you always kind of want to understand the customer's point of view and use the product from their point of view so you can sort of see what's going on, right?
Exactly. Well, and that brings up to me that uh will passengers want to keep doing this with right now 3 times the rate, canceled rides,
Yeah.
newbie drivers, hard to get a ride? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
are they going to get so turned off to all this Now I know the
Yeah.
service is what it is, and once it snaps back a bit, people most likely will
Yeah.
come back around. But I'm imagining that a lot of people are very up in arms right now.
Yeah. Well, I think they are, and or not. I think they are. Let's say it a little more authority. The passengers are definitely pissed. I think that reliability of Uber and Lyft is at an all-time low. But frankly, this isn't happening in a bubble, right? Like I think a lot of people point to Uber and Lyft. Oh, it's so unreliable. I mean, restaurants are unreliable. You know what I mean? Like other industries, right, that are relying on service and frontline, and even in the gig economy, some are more unreliable right now. So it's not just Uber and Lyft. There's a larger, kind of a macroeconomic labor shortage, to put it in fancy terms. But I think that the product itself, like unfortunately, I think one of the challenges for drivers and gig workers is that there is such a low barrier to entry, which is great when you're just getting started, but it can lead to oversupply. And especially with rideshare, frankly, like getting someone from A to B, like I've talked about how hard this job is, right? But it's also not that hard when you think about it, right? Like you can screw up a bunch of turns, you can drive too fast, you can, do a lot of things wrong, you can talk about all the wrong things, but at the end of the day, 99.99% of the time, you're still dropping your passenger off exactly where they want to go. So they're getting, their experience may not be great, but what they're paying for is getting from A to B, right? And that part of the experience has really been commoditized, and like it's kind of dummy proof, right? Like no matter how bad of a driver you are, even the worst drivers are still getting their passengers to where they want to go, right? Whereas with food delivery, if you screw a bunch of things up along the way, they get a cold order, right? Or they get the wrong meal, right? There's a lot actually that can go wrong there. And so I think that going I kind of forgot your original question before I went off on this tangent, but it just made me think of kind of on the driver's side, right? Like unfortunately, for drivers, right, like the being like a most amazing or best driver isn't always as valuable as you might hope. And I do think though, like on the oversupply issue, I do think that that has always been in the top three complaints of drivers and gig workers. It's like low pay, commissions too high, unfair deactivations, oversupply of drivers, right? Because the companies, they would rather have too many drivers than too few drivers for sure.
Oh, absolutely. Um, I think a lot of or I know a lot of markets too are very small. Like a city like Denver, it's not quite LA, but it's pretty spread in the way
Yeah.
that LA is. There's like 18 parts of downtown.
Yeah.
Um, a lot of cities just have 8 blocks of
Hmm.
downtown. So they do a lot of short rides. I think one thing for sure is the longer the ride,
Yeah.
the more it does matter your veteran status. Because if you're
Yeah.
taking somebody 10 blocks down, yeah, you're getting a A to B
Hmm.
and they're getting out. But at the same time, if I'm a lot of times here in Denver, we don't have a ton of short rides. Usually
Yeah.
it's 20, 25
Mm.
minutes on average. So
Yeah.
that's, you either have to
Well,
learn that your customer doesn't want to talk. Maybe they
yeah.
do. Try and read them. This is all part of being a service industry person.
Yeah.
You have to
Well,
know how to
and
read your room.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, I think that's a key skill to understand. And I mean, I think that you definitely you kind of have to know how to read the passenger. That's funny. I'm just thinking about all the rides I've had where, the driver hasn't known how to read the passenger.
Right.
But and I kind of joke sometimes too, like that's why I have a business, is because most people don't know how to read the room. They don't know how to read the passenger. They don't know necessarily what they're doing. But yeah, definitely important.
Because I've always actually been, whenever I see on social media all the tip comments and stuff,
Hmm.
I've always been on the other side of that because I worked for so many years in the bar industry
Yeah.
that I know how to. I mean, I'm only at, when I used to do that, it was 213 an hour is what you made.
Hmm.
That's what a bartender
Yeah.
makes because of tips.
Right.
And then we only claim our credit card tips, but
Yeah.
wink, wink, nobody knows that. But I mean, like that's how we get by. If you don't know how to make the tips, you're missing a big part of the game.
Yeah.
And I know it's tough to get the rideshare tips, but you got to work them. You got to try and
Yeah.
get those tips. I mean, you just do because yeah, you're going to make X amount, but you can make a lot more than X if you're not just so upset about making X.
Yeah, definitely agree.
because people can definitely read energy too. So your
Hmm.
passenger is going to read the energy in the car, even if you're not talking.
Yeah,
You know, they maybe you're not getting a tip because they just don't like you.
yeah.
I mean, I don't know how to put it any more blatant than that. But before, bef- so I don't know if it's smaller companies maybe have it in now too, or a better chance. I know that that's just been so
Oh yeah,
hard for the smaller companies.
yeah. No, I think that was the one thing I wanted to chime in before we wrap up here. I mean, I guess as far I started talking about as far as what the other options are, I mean, and like even other companies. I mean, I do think that Uber and Lyft are kind of the big boys. I mean, you're thinking about like other rideshare companies, how they might
Yeah,
fit
yeah.
in.
Yeah, like some of the startups, not like Alto, who's now, who's paying their to be
Mhm.
employees, but like more
Yeah.
like the ones I can't remember that started in Austin. It actually looked like it had a good little run. And then
Mm.
there's a bunch of other ones popping up
Yeah,
too.
I mean, I
But
think there's a couple lately. I guess I will not to dismiss them, but I think there's always sort of a flavor of the month, when it comes to new rideshare companies. Right now, I think we just posted about one starting in Hawaii called Hulolo, I think is what it's called. And then there's one that got a little bit of press in the past few weeks called Drivers Cooperative that's in New York. And I think the issue, well, I mean, I guess what I would say is that like I'm a big fan of all of these companies. I think that the more competition there is out there, the better. And Uber and Lyft do, especially Uber has a very dominant position in the rideshare market specifically. And I think that more competitors is a good thing. We saw Juno was probably the only real threat we've seen pop up in the past 5, 6, 7, or not 5, 6, past 5, 6 years, and that didn't end up going too great for drivers. I've got a podcast all about what went wrong if anyone's interested there, but it's like an hour discussion. And then there is Via, there's sort of an alternative. There's Via and Alto, but I think you're thinking more of the new ones. And I think the challenge is that we know there's a lot of issues on the driver's side, right? Like it's not hard to launch a new company. And I always get people emailing me saying, hey, I've got a great idea for a company, or hey, you should start your own company. I'm like, oh my God, that's the last thing I want to do. Really
right.
tough, really expensive, and really challenging. And I think that there are a lot of issues you can address on the supply side. So that's drivers, find a way to pay them better, lower commissions or at least more reasonable commissions, no more unfair deactivations, better support, no oversupply of drivers. Like those five things, boom, if you told every
Right.
driver that, it's like slam dunk, right? They'll sign up for you right then and there, but with the
And
caveat that they need to make money, they need rides. And I think that's what's challenging right now, or less challenging right now in the pandemic. But Uber, the product, from a rider's perspective, has always worked so well. And so I think unless you have a way that you're going to attract customers over, that you can't just charge cheaper than Uber, right? Like Uber has,
no,
we talked earlier about its cost, right? Like they've got, you can't like get a better deal on insurance than Uber has. They're doing millions of rides a day at scale. How are you going to get a better deal there, right? Like
right.
there's certain areas, right? But structurally, you have to find a way that you're going to outperform the product, right? And so I think that's what makes it so tough, is that it's hard to compete with Uber and really, make, you could say, okay, and this is what Juno did. They said, okay, our rides are going to be cheaper. And then over time, of course, as they got bigger, they can't be 15% cheaper than Uber forever. And so they started raising their prices. Boop, customers started going back over to Uber. And that's why I think right now is a really interesting time, because the rideshare services right now freaking suck, right? As we talked about, right? Reliability is super low, prices are super high. And so I guess what I'm saying is if I was going to launch a company, or if a
No,
company did
yeah.
have a shot, and even a small shot, like right now is the time where you can really start attacking, like, hey, what are all, you still might experience some of the same issues with driver shortages and things like that, but like, hey, maybe now's the time where you really do go and take a bunch of those most loyal Uber and Lyft drivers, and maybe now is the time where like they're willing to actually give up, they're making a bunch of money and they're willing to actually give up a few trips here and there to say, hey, you know what, I believe in this new company, I'm going to follow through. And so I do think that there's some interesting opportunity right now. I will be honest, I haven't seen, there's no company like out there that I'm like, oh my God, I'm so excited to talk to them and cover them, because I think they're going to be the ones to do it. But,
Right.
I think if someone was going to make it happen, now's the time.
Well, I think that we had a couple others too, like Trip Rides. That was like more of a pyramid thing, and that really brought
Yeah.
some bad PR to the smaller companies. But One thing I do want to get your
Although if
take on
people
is,
did read my site, I think the first and only thing we ever published about them was basically asking if they were a scam. So that is a good point, though. Like it's easy
yeah,
to put up a landing page, right? It's easy to talk about all the things that suck for drivers and to get people to sign up for an email list. And so the things that I
and
look
then
for,
and then they're data farming.
yeah. And so the things that I look for, just because I think this is important, we've got an article on my site about how to start a rideshare company. I always ask when people present me with a new company, do you have a functioning driver and rider app? Because that's expensive. Do you have commercial insurance, right? Because you need to insure drivers when they're on trips. And then third, are you approved by the local utility? So like here in California, it would be the California Public Utilities Commission, where you would literally, like, I should be able to go onto their website, look up your company, Steven Johnson rides, you've got a
Yes.
permit. Okay. And then at that point, and I will say 95% of the companies that come to me don't have all three of those things.
But what about like Ola and
Yeah.
Didi? I mean,
So,
they've put their footmark into the United States now. I
yeah.
mean,
Yeah. I think the international competitors are still maybe a little ways off. I think that, Didi just filed to go public, like they're looking at $100 billion. And it's kind of funny because Uber owns 12.8% of them. So they're going to get like close to $12 billion when they go public. So one of Uber's better investments, giving up in China. But I think that I feel like that could be less of a near term threat and maybe more of like a midterm threat. And I guess in the near term, it does seem like there's a lot more competition in the food delivery space. Like I could see Ola and Didi and some of these other companies clashing with Uber and food delivery. But I think on the rides piece, I just don't know if those companies are itching to, kind of try and come in and compete with Uber in the US market.
really. Hmm. I just wonder because it feels like they've been coming in for a while, and I feel like lately I've been reading more and more and more that they're here now. They're here, and I know they've been here for a while, but I feel like they're here wanting to do
Yeah.
business. They're not just here
Um,
because they're here.
maybe I haven't really seen them making too much headway myself personally on the ride side, but again,
Yeah,
right? Like if I'm Didi right
but
now,
those
like
would be big
right now, my
companies to
right,
compete.
those would be, and those would be kind of the companies, and so I guess that's really to put a button on my point is I think it's gonna be tough for anyone small to medium to compete with Uber and Lyft at scale, but I do think maybe some of these bigger excuse me,
Bless
maybe
you.
some of these bigger companies might have might be having a chance, or they might be thinking about it. But I don't think anyone's made a big. I mean, I know no company has made a big announcement or big push, right? They haven't launched in LA. Didi hasn't launched in LA, San
Right. Yeah.
Francisco, Chicago, New York. Those would be kind of like the announcements that would tell me like, whoa, these guys are
Right.
for
Yeah.
real.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to keep you any longer, and I really appreciate you coming on because I know you got a commotion in Miami this week, right?
Yeah, I'm headed to Miami for my first in-person conference on Wednesday, so that should be fun. I'm moderating a panel all about the curb, and so sort of like the curb space, and actually, so a lot of like food delivery and restaurants, takeouts, pick up and drop off for Uber and Lyft drivers. So there's a lot going on at the curb, and that's sort of like one of the things I like focusing on these days. Not the curb itself, but just sort of like how rideshare interacts with a lot of these other areas, like rideshare and food delivery, rideshare and the curb, for example, or AVs, whatever it might be. So lots of stuff happening. Appreciate you having me on.
Yeah. And everybody, if you don't know Harry, I'd be shocked because he's been around for since before me and anybody else I know. So if you haven't heard of him, it must be your first day driving or something. And
I'm
the
sure there's still plenty.
rideshareguy.com. And
Yeah, I appreciate
I
that. No,
don't
I'm
know.
sure there's
I
still
think that most
some.
people most people I run into know of your name, or I don't know. It's
Yeah.
pretty common if you YouTube something on rideshare, you've been around longer than everybody else. So I mean, like you're gonna see you come up.
Yeah, that is one of my
So
goals is sort of be like a cockroach, never die everywhere. You type something related to rideshare, Uber, now
yeah.
even some food delivery topics into a box on the internet. And hopefully if I pop up, I'm doing my job.
Yep. But I got my hat here.
Oh, nice. Looking good.
So thanks for that. And Harry, thank you for coming on. I think that a lot of people are concerned. I think that a lot of people are wondering what's going to happen with rideshare, and I think some things do need to happen. I do think that
Yeah.
to maintain good drivers, something's going to need to change if they just want
Yeah.
to keep onboarding and going through. And being a business owner myself for many different times in my lifetime, I know that overhead of employees is what can kill you quick.
Yeah.
So I mean, losing people in a week, like
Yeah.
it might seem like it works, but over time, you're better if people are connecting and liking
Yep.
it.
And that's why the independent contractor model is so powerful for the
Yeah.
companies. But we'll see. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah. Thanks, Harry.